The American dream promised that if you worked hard, you could build a stable life. You could afford to buy a house, raise a family, retire with dignity. But today, millions of Americans feel like that promise has vanished. Housing is unaffordable, healthcare is crushingly expensive, wages feel stuck while everything else climbs. This raises an uncomfortable question. Was the American dream ever real, or was it always a lie? This is the Quiet Republic. Post-World War II, a new social order began. A groundwork had been laid through Roosevelt's New Deal policies. Soldiers came home from war, and while many struggled to settle back into civilian life and with mental health issues, economically, the stage was set. A boom of industry, business, and genuine middle-class prosperity was on the horizon. From roughly 1945 to 1975, an economy was built and thrived, one that made a promise to each succeeding generation that prosperity was possible, that if you had the desire and the work ethic, you could build a life for yourself, and not just a life, but a prosperous one. Let's not for a moment take this concept, though, and apply it to every single person that was living in this era. While a thriving middle class did come to exist, this was not the case for everyone. Rural areas of the country struggled with poverty as they always had. Jobs and careers were often found in densely populated urban areas and cities, and for the majority of black people, especially in the South. While economic momentum was technically possible, racial segregation and suppression were still very much a part of daily life. So when I say things like a thriving middle class, a booming economy, I'm speaking in generalities. I'm speaking in statistical numbers. For those soldiers returning home from the war, the Servicemen's Readjustment Bill, also known as the GI Bill, was signed into law, and this bill provided veterans with unemployment pay, education, and training for career jobs. It offered low interest loans for family homes and business ventures. In other words, there was an avenue for the creation of a thriving portion of the population who could utilize government, also known as taxpayer-funded advantages, and gain economic stability and momentum to change their lives. During this time, labor unions were also expanding. Post-Gilded Age unions secured better wages for workers, and solidarity among the working class had gained a sort of traction never before seen in America. Housing was cheap, and single-income households were not just possible, they were oftentimes the norm. The future looked bright, and it was bright for many. Home ownership skyrocketed during this period, wages grew with productivity, and college became accessible for most. So what happened? Because what I just described above, that doesn't sound like the majority experience for Americans today. From 1948 to 1973, productivity and wages rose together. But after 1973, wages didn't. Workers produced more, but they were paid less relative to their productivity. Housing during this period also became financialized, so homes became assets rather than just places to live. Corporate consolidation was also taking place. Like we talked about in the last video, corporations and the billionaire class were starting to buy out competitors, and captured markets are never as affordable as free markets. So it was during this period that we started seeing a decline in labor unions as well. Without these unions, the workers had less bargaining power. And it was in the 1970s that we started seeing moneyed interest begin lobbying the government, its officials, and representatives of the people. During the same period, the hollowing out of the middle class was beginning, and the shaping of a new class, the billionaire class, was forming, a transfer of wealth from the many to the few. By the late 1970s, the economic system that had built the American middle class was already starting to weaken. Wages had become stagnant, and unions were losing influence. Corporate consolidation was quietly reshaping entire industries. But in the 1980s, a new economic philosophy began to dominate American politics. The idea was simple. Governments should step back. Markets should lead. Regulation was seen as barriers to growth. Taxes on corporations and wealthy individuals were seen as punishments for success, and labor unions were increasingly portrayed as obstacles rather than partners in the economy. This philosophy would eventually become known as neoliberalism. Though most Americans never heard that word, what they experienced were its policies. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, these ideas moved from theory into actual policy. Taxes on high earners were dramatically reduced. Financial markets were deregulated. And in 1981, when air traffic controllers went on strike, Reagan fired them, more than 11,000 of them, sending a clear signal that the federal government would no longer protect organized labor in the way it once had. These policies didn't create the economic shifts we've already discussed, but they accelerated them. The gap between productivity and wages continued to widen. Corporate power expanded, and the economic center of gravity began shifting away from workers and towards capital. At the same time, globalization was transforming the economy. Manufacturing jobs that had once anchored American communities were increasingly moved overseas in search of cheaper labor. Supply chains stretched across continents now, and not just locally. Corporations became global, but workers, they didn't. By the 1990s and early 2000s, this new economic model had become the norm across both major political parties. Free trade agreements expanded. Financial markets grew more powerful. Corporate consolidation continued. Then in the early 2000s, the United States entered yet another era. After the attacks of September 11th, the country launched what would become decades of war in the Middle East. These wars cost trillions of taxpayer dollars and reshaped American foreign policy for a generation, or maybe more. Meanwhile, at home, the same economic trends continued. Corporate lobbying expanded, industries became increasingly consolidated, and political influence began to follow wealth more closely than ever before. The middle class that had defined the American dream in the mid-20th century was being hollowed out. Not by a single decision, though. It was by decades of economic change, policy change, and shifting priorities. And by the time the 21st century arrived, the American dream that once felt attainable for millions of families was already becoming harder and harder to reach. I'm a millennial. I was born in 1995. My generation is the first in about a century that is statistically worse off than my parents. Gen Z, Gen Alpha, they're entering an economy that looks even harder. Housing is unaffordable for millions of people. Stable, prosperous lives feel out of reach for the majority of the population. And at the same time, we live in a world saturated with distractions. Social media, smartphones, algorithms designed to keep you scrolling on the very device you're probably watching this video on right now. When life feels unstable, people look for escape. And we're told that the problem is personal responsibility. Cancel Netflix, skip the iced coffee. But people aren't canceling subscriptions and skipping coffee their way out of reality. That reality is that life has become increasingly unaffordable, and it's been trending that way for decades. At the moment, I'm not particularly optimistic that this trend is going to reverse on its own. So, was the American dream a lie? Not entirely, but it was never universal, and it didn't last very long. What we now call the American dream, it existed, and in its strongest form existed for maybe 30 years. It was a historical moment, but it was sold as a permanent promise. Is the American dream dead? For a lot of people today, it feels like it is. But history also shows us something important. The middle class didn't appear by accident. It was built. It was built through policy, through labor power, and through a political system that, at least for a time, prioritized ordinary people over concentrated wealth. If enough people demanded it again, if citizens pressure elected officials to represent voters instead of corporations, then it's possible that something like it could exist again. It won't look like the 1950s, and maybe we don't want it to be. The real question isn't whether we can recreate the past. It's whether we can build something better for our future. Maybe the job of our generation isn't to restore the American dream of the 20th century. Maybe it's to build a new one for the 21st, for the 2030s, for the 2040s, for the generation that comes after us. This has been the Quiet Republic.